Welcome to 7322 Change Management. Today we have a guest lecturer, Dr. Matt Kutz from Bowling Green State University in Ohio, USA. Dr. Kutz is a world-renowned writer in leadership and in change. He's written a number of books, one about contextual intelligence, which is, I guess, a newer model of leadership. But today he wants to talk to you about influencing change with positive communication, which fits in really nicely with our topics this week. So I'm going to pass over to Dr. Kutz, who can, I believe they call him Matty, because he's actually an adjunct research fellow here at Griffith at HSM. Is also a Fulbright student in 2013, was that right? Yeah. And so Matt's got some wonderful information for you, which I think you're going to find very, very exciting. So thanks, Matty.
Thank you
I'll leave
very
it over
much.
to you.
Gazer?
Gazer.
Thank you, Gazer. Appreciate that. So I'm really excited to be with you guys today. We're going to talk about influencing change and how important communication is in the change process. I do have a little disclaimer. Some people get anxious and nervous when we talk about books and things. I'm obviously not trying to sell or promote my books, but a lot of the content that you'll be hearing today, I have written 2 books on. I just show you those really quickly here. One is called Contextual Intelligence. This book actually was Leadership Book of the Year for Innovation and Cutting Edge Perspective in Leadership category. So I'm really excited about that. How thinking in 3 dimensions can help resolve complexity, uncertainty, and ambiguity in the crazy world we live in now. So that's one. And then the other book that's brand new, matter of fact, it's still in the shrink wrap package. I just received this myself. And this book is Leadership Questions for Healthcare Professionals. And basically this is applying theories and principles to practice on different leadership issues and questions that come up. So both of these books are in my talk today, and the content that we'll be covering is covered in both of those books. So I wanted to just let you know that up front. If I were to tell you what the big picture idea here that I have for us today is how to use communication to influence change and advocate for ourselves, our staffs, and then the industry that we work in, whether that's healthcare, whether it's clinical work, administrative work, management work, leadership work, whatever. We need to be able to be good advocates for ourselves, for our patients, for others, for our employees, our staff, etc. And I really believe and am convicted that these principles that we talk about today can help with that process. So specific outcomes from a good pedagogy perspective would be, I'm going to introduce and discuss what's called the mathematical theory of communication, which was a study presented in the early 1940s in the United States, which is underpinning a lot of what communication theory is today. We're going to talk about complexity and the chaotic nature of healthcare and how to communicate change in a chaotic environment. Everything works great when everything's working great. When all things are structured and functioning and there's nothing unexpected, things tend to work well. But when things change and things get shifted on us, how does communication shift? And consequently, how is change affected by that? And then we'll discuss some specific strategies on how to implement change towards the end. So that's the 3 things I hope to accomplish. So I wanted to start right off the bat with the intent of every encounter with any person at any time is to get them to change something. And I don't know if we really think about what that means. When we talk to anybody, when we communicate to anybody, regardless of the method or the mode of communication, so verbal communication, emails, texting, video chatting, whatever, any and every mode of communication that we have, whenever we engage in it, we are trying to get them to change something. So essentially, our life as managers, as leaders, as clinicians, whatever it is about getting people to change what they're doing, even if that something is merely getting them to stop what they're thinking about right now or what they're doing right now and just to turn around and return a greeting to you. And I don't know that we think about that and how significant and pervasive change really is when we communicate. So anytime you're walking down the hallway and you wave, hey, hi, or good day, or how you doing, or hello to somebody, we're asking them to change whatever it is they're doing and pay attention to me, because I obviously am more important than whatever they're thinking about. And when we try to think about communication that way, we begin to realize everything with communication is about change. So I wanted to kind of set that big, broad picture framework for us as we understand and delve into this concept of thinking, and which leads me to what is good and what is bad communication. And I'm sure you've seen similar graphs and charts about on communication in this regard, but I'd like to point out what communication is ultimately about: the outcome. There's a lot of research, a lot of theories on specific techniques of communication, and I would like to maybe change some of how we view communication. A lot of us will take a communication course, for example. We'll take workshops and seminars as we develop in our careers and our professions on how to be a good communicator. We'll talk about specific strategies of communication and the 8 steps of communicating, creating urgency, and the different things that a lot of the courses are about, that we read about, and those are all good and well. But at the end of the day, whether or not you use the strategy correctly is irrelevant to whether it works or not. We need to start thinking of communication in terms of the outcomes that happen. Has communication actually occurred? And we measure that not by the process that we did, but we measure that by the outcomes that happened as a result of what was trying to be communicated. So I've got some examples here of what good communication and bad communication look like. So good communication means that the people have understood what has gone on. They understand the situation that they are involved in right now. A lot of times people have no idea what they're involved in right now, what the consequences are, what the repercussions are of a certain conversation, a certain meeting. And if they walk away not knowing that, misunderstanding what's going on, then bad communication has occurred. Good communication is when people walk away and have a sense of what's going on and what was meant. Good communication, differences are resolved. Bad communication, differences are highlighted or even inflated. And it's really important that every encounter we have, differences should be being resolved or understood as a metric for successful communication. Good communication builds trust and fosters respect. Bad communication encourages distrust and fosters a lack of respect. And that's, again, an important thing to understand, is even though somebody can repeat back to you what you said, you communicate something, you communicate an idea about a new strategy, a new program, a new vision, maybe it's a work performance issue, and you've communicated to this employee, the staff person, exactly what has happened, and they nod their head in agreement, yes, I understand, and they can repeat back. But if they walk away thinking, boy, he's not trustworthy, or that he did that awfully harsh, and there's a lack of respect or a lack of trust fostered, then good communication probably didn't really occur. And then finally, good communication fosters creativity and critical thinking. One of my favorite concepts and words used is innovation, which obviously relates very closely with change. And we've got to understand that when you communicate well, people walk away asking better questions. And that's really important, because a lot of the questions we get in the communication and change process are what? How come? How come you're doing that? Or what's the benefit for this for me? And they ask very close-ended questions of, do I have to be here at what time? And they just get facts and data, as opposed to the good way to communicate is when communication has occurred well, they walk away with better ideas, better questions, thinking about how whatever the idea is that's being presented to them can reach beyond their normal scope. And so when we think about communicating that way, it really has to change the way we communicate. And that's necessary for us to do. In order to understand that process, I'd like to introduce to you the mathematical theory of communication. Now, this was a theory developed in the United States back in the late 1940s, so it's been around a while, and it is considered one of the foundational elements to what we know today in communication theory. And they basically identified 7 distinct factors that go on in the communication process. And if you take a bird's eye view back and look at all of this picture, you'll find that we really focus on a very small percentage of what communication really looks like. And if we're really trying to initiate change, we want to initiate new policies, new procedures, more important than that, new behaviors. We want people to be engaged in the workplace, to enjoy their work, to raise morale in the workplace. Then we've got to start to understand that all that happens through change processes, and that change process, it very much is predicated on, or the linchpin for that foundational piece to that is how we communicate. And if we're not understanding all the variables and factors in the communication process, we're never going to be able to get anybody to change the way we need them to change and influence them the way we need to influence them. So I've got two pictures here. The first picture of the blue book is the original manuscript, the original journal. And then the gray picture there is the new book now. It's the same research that has been developed and revised over the years. So, but this is the mathematical theory of communication. And I want you to notice here the blue dot. There's the source, then there's the encoding, then there's the channel, the decoding, the receiver, and then the feedback loop. And then in the context of all that, or the backdrop to all that is the context. And my shoulder's covering the context, sorry. The context is where it all takes place there. Now here's the interesting part to this process, and what we're going to do in the next few minutes is uncover and talk about each one of these areas. But I want you to see what happens to the message, because we've got these red dots as the message gets changed as the channel goes. And we call it, there's a game we play in the United States, you may have heard of it, called the telephone game. And it's something we do in the classroom. And you have a message written down, and the message might be, Sally was late to work today because her child was ill. And that's the message. And we create a line, and only the first person in the line has the original message. And we make the line 10 to 12 people deep. And we give it to the first person, and they have to turn around and read the message as it's written to the second person in line. Sally was late to work today because her child was ill. Pass it on. And they go to the person, they turn to the person behind them, and they say, Sally is late to work today because her child was sick. Or they change it, there's a slight alteration. And by the time you get to the end, you ask the person at the end of the line, what was the message that was read at the beginning? Almost 100% of the time, the message is different than what was originally read at the beginning. And you wonder, how did the message get changed in the process when everybody is communicating the same thing? The answer to that is represented in these different colored arrows here. So the message starts off as, let's say, red, but by the time it gets to the end, it changes colors completely because of the different processes that's going on in the communication process. And that's what this is. So we need to know that as managers, as leaders, as administrators, as health service managers. It is absolutely critical that you know right from the beginning, no matter what message you say, no matter how much of the script you followed, what you say is not what is heard. And you just need to know that. I mean, it's one of those things you can try and try and try to be exacting as you can. It's just human nature that people will alter and change the original message to suit their experience, their filters, their process. And they might not like the word ill, for example, so they'll change it to sick or under the weather or something like that. And by the time the message gets to the end, Sally was late to work today because she doesn't like her child, or because she's a absentee parent, you know. And all of a sudden a story is created that's not true to the original story because of everybody else's filter, because somewhere along the line in that chain, only bad parents get sick children. Because, you know, if you were a good parent, you take care of your child and you get them to the hospital right away, you get them to the physician right away, and everything's taken care of. So hopefully that would never happen. But for somebody somewhere, sick children means a negligent parent. And by the time you get to the end of the message, oh, the message is not the child was ill, the message is Sally's a negligent parent. And that's really important for us as communicators to understand. And that's kind of what we illustrate here. And we're going to now take some time and unpack each of these processes for us. So what's the source? The first step in this mathematical theory of communication is understanding the source. That's the sender of the message. That's me, that's you, the person doing the communicating. I would venture to guess, in my experience, I've been doing this for over 20 years. I've been doing consulting quite a bit with large corporations. A huge percentage of my business and leadership consulting is with healthcare organizations. I have some very large multinational clients that I work with, and I would say one of the biggest issues with communicating effectively across an organization, and especially when it comes to implementing change in a very complex, complicated organization, is that the person doing the communicating doesn't even know their own biases and their own preferences. And so we have to understand the first part of communicating well is understanding how you like to be talked to, how you prefer to be talked to, how you like to communicate, because chances are you're going to communicate to others in the way that you prefer to be talked to and communicated to, which ironically, based on the fact that we're probably in management positions or leadership positions, means our personality is different than most of the other people in an organization. So right off the bat, we're at a disadvantage by not knowing our own preference and style versus someone else's. And if I could just back away and give a little example of this from in the context of a partnership or a marriage, a romantic partnership. There is a very widely read book in the United States. I don't know if you have it here. It's called The 5 Love Languages. And what's interesting about that is the whole crux of the book is a clinical psychologist did this research on why married couples argue and fight so much. And he boiled it down to when couples communicate with each other, they basically communicate in one of 5 different ways. And there's 5 what he calls love languages, but you could actually call them any form of a communication language. And they prefer to receive information in a certain way. And my wife and I have gone through this because we communicate differently. And one of my language that I prefer to be talked to is called a gift language. So I like to receive affirmation, and I like to receive communication, especially when somebody's asking me to do something outside of my comfort zone, which is a lot of what change is about. I like to have that couched in or in a gift. You're going to bring me something and then tell me what you want, and I'm much more likely to receive that and do it when I understand, because that's my language. My wife, on the other hand, her love language or her communication language is service, what they call acts of service. So what that means is, and for the first 5 or 6 years of our marriage, we couldn't get along at all. We fought like cats and dogs. We were always banging heads against each other. I couldn't get her to change anything I needed her to change. She couldn't get me to change anything that she wanted me to change, because every time I wanted something from her, I would bring her a gift or some kind of little gift. And she wouldn't receive it the way I meant it. She thought I was being wasteful with our money. And so she was always resentful of, not only am I asking her to do something that she didn't want to do, but because I was not aware of the language I was using to communicate, she was actually resentful and resistant to anything I suggested. And the same thing was true on the other side. She would come to me and ask me to do something or change some specific behavior, and she would do it by doing acts of service for me, pack my lunch, iron my clothes, fold my laundry, these kind of things, which I could care less if it was done or not. And so we were always fighting against each other because I didn't understand my message and how I preferred, and she didn't understand hers, until we went through a couple courses and saw a therapist and a counselor and all those things that you do to try to learn to get along. I realized that I use a specific language, and I didn't understand this very first premise that I have a source, or as the source, I send a certain message, and I send that message the way that I would like to have received it, instead of putting myself in their perspective. So the source is then the message refers to the information and the ideas that you want to deliver. So you have to know what you're delivering. We might say we're delivering information. Somebody else, they might be not receiving information. They're receiving a reprimand. To me, it's just facts, just the facts. You were late at work today. You missed your quota. You missed your cutoff, and we're just conveying information. And we say things, silly things, actually, like, well, it's not personal, it's business. And this is not personal, this is just business. And to the other person, it's only personal. And we have to understand that. So a big part of communicating for change, it gets misconstrued right off the bat when we don't understand our own source, ourself as the source of information. So we need to be very clear about the message you want to send, and and we need to ask ourselves, why should anyone care about the message we're sending? So it's not about conveying information, it's about putting ourselves in their perspective, so understand the reason why they want to know this or need to know this is because it doesn't just affect the bottom line and the business and their job, but it actually improves patient care, for example, or it actually improves their quality of life outside of the office, outside of work. And we have to begin to understand how and why people would care about what we want to say to them. And again, what message are we sending? We're sending a certain message every time we communicate. We need to know what that message is. And here's the fact. This is just an undisputable fact. Whatever message you think you're sending is not the message that is being sent. And we need to start from the beginning understanding that. And the quicker we do that, the quicker change can happen. Now, the next stage, after we come to terms with our communication and the understanding what message we're sending, then we understand that every message goes through an encoding process. The encoding process is a stage that involves putting the message into a format that we can send. So the sender is still doing the encoding. So let's say I'm talking, here's an example of how encoding works, at work, I'm considered a good communicator. So I do all the right things in terms of I use my hands enough, but not too much. I use my hands just enough to make sure people are engaged. I follow all the right rules. At my students at the university, my door is always open. I have nice, comfortable chairs. I don't have the standard, office chairs for them to sit in. I've got big, comfy wingback chairs, and I have a little bowl of candy dish on my desk, so students feel welcome to come in and all this. So I'm known as a good communicator on campus. And when I talk to students, I talk to them a certain way and use a certain style because I know I'm trying to understand my audience. The first day that I was told I was a good communicator from my colleagues, I was kind of chuckled because the night immediately preceding that, my wife and I just got in an argument about what a lousy communicator I was and how I wasn't a very good communicator. And so I came home from work really excited because I had the document there, my performance review, and I said, "Hey, honey, check this out. I'm a good communicator." And she laughed out loud. She just like, "Oh, that's ridiculous." And what we begin to discover through that process is the metrics for success in one area, like with my students in the classroom, are completely different. My wife uses a completely different metrics of success for communication. Now, what that means for us in health service management is astronomical. It's huge because what that means is every employee that you have, every person on your team, every person you have to communicate with uses a different metric for successful communication. As an encoder of a message, it is your responsibility to frame or code that message in such a way that the person who's receiving it understands it in the way you meant it to be understood. So where my wife's idea of good communication is completely different than the university's, I've learned now to change my style. When I'm talking to my wife, she doesn't care that I stand and use my hands and do all the kind of stuff. She wants a personal connection. My students, they want a personal connection too, but not to the degree and to the level that my wife does or my children do, for example. So that's really important that we understand that. So we have to encode every message so that the person on the other end can decode it to their process. I use another illustration of currency. Where I carry around dollars, United States, US dollars. And if I am in Rwanda or if I am in South Africa or Australia and I go up to a vendor and give them dollars, American dollars, it's worthless paper. They want Australian currency. Rwandans want Rwandan currency. South Africans want South African currency. And if I'm trying to do all my exchange of business in American dollars, I'm not transacting any business. I can't be an effective communicator, and I can't transact any business. Same thing's true with communicating with people. If I'm trying to communicate to someone using my currency, the way that I like to be talked to, they might not receive it. So whereas my wife only accepts euros and my university folks only accept dollars, I have to learn to switch currencies based on the situation that I'm in. And that's what encoding is all about. You need to understand the situation that you're in and switch currencies every time you talk to someone else. So you might be talking with your colleagues at a staff meeting and they require one currency. You might be talking with a group of nurses and physicians later on in that same day and they require a completely different currency. And the problem we run into with initiating change, especially in an organization that spans many different divisions and departments, we're trying to use one currency to talk to 5 or 6 different constituent groups that take 5 or 6 different currencies. And that's really important for us to understand. So encoding becomes a critical part to initiating change in the management process. So we've got to understand that the tone, the attitude in which we present it to, like I talk to physicians differently than I talk to students. And I don't mean be more professional language and different terms. I mean even the attitude that I bring. There's a certain times being cocky and arrogant is more accepted, and not too much, but you've got to learn to gauge when can I be aggressive in my communication and when should I not be aggressive in my communication. When should my attitude be more aloof and I'm the expert and I know what I'm talking about, and when should it be less? And we've got to learn to gauge that. And the biggest problem I see in coaching executives and working with people in larger organizations is they don't know when to switch what channel of when to be, I'm the expert and I'm always the expert. No, you're the expert in this area only. You're not always the expert in everything, but they present themselves as, well, they're the expert in everything all the time, and it creates a persona that certain people resist or accept. And you have to learn what that is and how to switch between currencies when you're talking. And that's what encoding is ultimately all about. The last bullet point there says a successful encoder knows their audience and they avoid making assumptions about the receiver's existing knowledge base and even their values. And this is another thing that is really important. We don't have time in this section to talk about the values piece, but it's very much a misunderstood and missed element of communicating for change. Most people are doing what they do because of a set of values that drives their performance. That value might be healthcare, that value might be patient satisfaction, that value might be personal income, that value might be personal satisfaction of a job well done. Every single person we have has a different value system for how they rate the effectiveness of their life in general and the work that they do. And if we don't tune into that and try to filter what that is, we will never be a successful encoder to them, and which means they'll never be able to understand what it is we're trying to get them to do. The next piece, after we identify our own preferences as the source, then we understand how to alter that and encode that for the receiver. Now we've got to pick the proper channel in how we convey that information. So this is the mode of transmitting the message, okay? So we have to choose wisely and we have to choose multiple modes. This is, again, the breakdown in this category happens with choosing the right mode of communication. In other words, here's a common problem we have in the workforce today is multiple generations in the workforce. We've got baby boomers, we've got millennials, and we've got Generation Z now, which are the 22-year-olds and less. So millennials are actually kind of the mid-workforce, and people like me, who is a Generation Xer or maybe even a very late baby boomer, think everybody's a millennial. And that's really not true. Any young person is not a millennial. Millennials are now in the middle of the workforce. And the reason that's important is for us to understand that as a Generation X, I am not a technological native. I'm an immigrant into the technology world. So I can survive just fine without instant messaging, without Facebook, without Instagram, without Snapchat, without all the social media, without email even. When I didn't even have an email account till I was in my doctoral studies. So I made it through all my entire undergraduate studies, through most of my master's degree work without even having an email account because email didn't exist. And when I needed to look something up, I had to go to a library and actually get a book, a physical book, and actually get out a book and actually open the page. There was no Wikipedia, there was no Google. I had to look it up. And so I'm very comfortable with telling to a student, if they can't find information, well, did you go to the library? And when I say they have, did I go to the library? They're like, what's a library? You know? And I'm being a little facetious, but my point is we introduce these channels. So some people are very comfortable with email, other people are not comfortable with email. Matter of fact, I was having that's funny. Here's a good example from even this very morning. I'm having a little bit of trouble with my cellular service and my mobile number, and the company is kind of a younger company. They want me to do the online instant chatting to resolve the problem, and I don't want to do that. I want to call and actually talk to a human person to solve the problem. They want me to chat with them because that's an expedient means for them. They can do because they can do multiple things. They can chat with 2 or 3 people at the same time back in their call center. But if I call them, it takes away from their productivity, and now they've got to talk to one person, voice to voice. That's the channel we're talking about. So this is also important. So after you figure out who you are, after you figure out how to code the message, now you need to choose the proper technique to deliver that message. So you have to choose wisely, and you have to choose multiple, because chances are the constituent group or the stakeholder group that you're reaching out to is comprised of a span of age groups and preferences. So you might have a few that prefer to hear their information in a face-to-face meeting. You might have a few that prefer to hear their information in an online meeting, a virtual meeting. You might have others who prefer email only or an instant message or text. And how do you pick which that is? And you need to pick the appropriate one because it's going to be conveyed the most effectively. I'm here right now with a group of 10 students from the United States. I would prefer to meet every morning at 10 o'clock or whatever, a designated time, to go over our routine and our schedule for the day, our itinerary. And that's my preference. And they just revolted against that the very first day. By the end of the first day, they had set up a group message on Facebook and the instant messaging on the iPhone, and they have a class group and all this. And now I just send them a text every morning and send it, and they all get it at the same time. That's what they preferred. I would have never preferred that, but if I wanted to be effective, I need to choose that channel wisely. So that's really important that verbal communication could be face-to-face meetings, telephone, video conferences, etc. Written communication, our letters. I mean, I actually know people, older folks in my department where I come from, who still use memos, like typewritten, handwritten memos, and they go to the mailboxes every day and they put a handwritten memo or a note in everybody's mailbox because that way they can say, no, you had it in writing, kind of a thing. And other faculty will only use messaging or emails. And it's your responsibility as the communicator and the originator of the change process to figure out each one. The biggest mistake we make in this area is we assume that one way works for everybody. And that way usually is the way you prefer. I prefer meetings. So I think everybody prefers meetings. So I schedule a meeting every week. And we have a staff meeting every week to communicate the information, when I'm the only one that likes to see everybody's face in the morning. Everybody else would prefer to just get a message on their phone about the agenda and the activities for the day. So that's really important to understand. So that's the channel. The next part is, and I want to point out too that the source, the encoding, and the channel originates with the sender of the message. These next two pieces, now the message has been transferred and now it has to be decoded. So now this is the listener's responsibility. Okay? So the listener now has to decode the message that you sent. You spent a lot of time encoding it, making it what you wanted it to be. Picked a lot of time picking the right channels, understanding yourself and your preferences to get it out there, and then they get this message like a gift. It's like a present they get at a holiday time. And they get this awesome message that you spent so much time wrapping and packaging and handling and all this, and you give them this message. Now they have to unwrap it. They have to unwrap the message. They have to decode it, and they're going to decode it according to their experiences, their background, their biases, their beliefs about who you are, about who the organization is, and about what they preconceive what you want them to do. So they are not, and that in and of itself means they're never going to receive the message the way you meant it to be received. You have to know that up front. Okay? So successfully decoding the message then is really important as well. And this is where confusion typically occurs. We use the phrase lost in translation. And this is where that lost in translation process happens. Now there's two things that can happen in this process. One is you literally just said the wrong message and there's not a word that translates well from their experience. Or, as we mentioned earlier, you're using the wrong currency altogether. You're trying to communicate in euros and they only take francs, for example. So it's really important that you understand that. So again, that falls on us, but they're only going to receive whatever they're accustomed to receiving. And that's really important that you understand what that language is. Now, this also means that the communication process isn't solely dependent on the sender. There's a receiver's responsibility as well. This is a partnership in good communication. So when good communication isn't happening, or when communication is failing, you have to look at how your source, you have to look at how you encoded it, you have to look at the channels you used, but it also may be appropriate at times to look at the decoder's responsibility, because as the receiver of a message, if I want to have high morale and work well in the environment I'm in, I need to put some effort into understanding the sender of the message's background as well. So it goes both ways. It's really important to understand. And then finally, you want the action, and having the receiver then is about making sure they understand what it is you're trying to tell them. So it's your job as the sender to take the receiver's ideas and feelings into consideration when encoding your message. Now, in healthcare, we use a phrase evidence-based practice. Evidence-based practice consists of it's three things: the best available clinical evidence, the clinician's experience, and the patient's expectations. And in healthcare, working with physicians in particular, and nurses and other allied healthcare professionals, we tend to overemphasize what the research says and undervalue or underemphasize the patient's expectations, for example. We say, well, this is the best intervention, this is the best treatment, therefore this is the treatment we're going to do, whether you like it or not, whether you need it or not, whether you believe in it or not, we're doing this treatment because the research says this is the best. Well, that's a poor use of evidence-based practice. Now, research obviously has to be in the equation. We have to consider it, and it's also a very important part of that equation. But there are certain patients who will be like, no, I refuse to do that. Well, what do we do in situations where a patient refuses to have this type of intervention? Well, we've got to find out a certain way to intervene for them. This is the same thing true as in communication. There are certain people on your team, in your department, that you work with either as a peer, either as a supervisor, or as a subordinate on your team who just refuse to get along with everybody else. Yes, you would like to mandate to them they have to do this and that's the easy way out. That's the autocratic way out, kind of the dictatorship way out. But if we are truly after transformational leadership models, servant leadership models, visionary leadership models, and things like that, then we need to also try our best to understand, well, why is it that they're being so obstinate to this change process? Chances are it's because there's what we call competing stakeholder values. So you need to understand they're valuing something different than what you're valuing. And you need to take the course of action to understand what values they're working on so that you can understand in evidence-based practice terms, what are the patient's expectations in this case, or the receiver's expectations. Now to do this, we have to brush up on our contextual intelligence. And this is, again, the book here that I mentioned a minute ago. More than a minute ago now. I don't know how long I've been talking enough, but this is where some of this stuff comes in. So I've got about maybe 10 or 15 more minutes here, and we'll kind of unpack some of the contextual intelligence stuff. The last two pieces to this mathematical theory of communication, though, is the feedback loop, which is really important. And I just want to highlight, once the receiver gets it, it comes back to the source. And either the change happened the way it was supposed to happen and the way the leader wanted it to happen, which is great, and that feedback comes back, which is it's great but also rare, or something else happened. The change maybe occurred, but it didn't occur the way you wanted it to, or it didn't occur with as much excitement and vigor as you hoped it would be received. And that feedback is important. So what do I do with that feedback? That feedback then is really critical. And it could be short-term feedback like body language, like you may have just communicated something and they may visibly and physically roll their eyes and like, oh my God, this person, what are they talking about? And you get instant feedback, okay, they didn't get it. They didn't understand what I was trying to say. Or it might be down the road later, you get a certain behavior, you see a certain behavior that you didn't necessarily want. That may be the other sign. So you're always looking for feedback. A good communicator is always looking for feedback and always adjusting their encoding process based on that feedback. If you become indignant and you become rigid in structure and say, I'm only going to communicate this way, it's just my personality, it's just the way I am, that's lazy communicating. You need to learn to adjust your style based on the feedback you get from the audience, both as a collective group and as individuals. So we call this in decision-making science, there's double loop learning process. And what that means is it's about our assumptions we make about life. A single loop process works like this, and this is how many people solve problems. They identify a problem. Okay, we don't have enough money to spend on the programs we need. So we identify a problem and we try to solve that problem with a solution. We try a solution, and if that solution doesn't work, we go back and we just try a different solution. If that solution doesn't work, we just go back and try a different solution. And it's just new solution, new solution, new solution until something works. And that's incredibly ineffective. That's the single loop process. The double loop process works like this. We identify a problem, we try a solution, the solution doesn't work. So when the solution doesn't work in the double loop process, we don't assume that we've selected the right problem or identified the right problem. So much of leadership, so much of change management is about identifying the right problem and asking the right questions. So let me kind of just summarize it again. So in the single loop process, I identify a problem, I try to solve it, the solution I tried doesn't work, so I try a new solution. The whole time in a single loop process, the problem that I've identified stays the same. The problem doesn't move. The problem is what it is, and I could not have made a mistake in identifying what the problem is. I just picked the wrong solution. In the double loop process, I identify what the problem is, I try the solution doesn't work. Before I try another solution, I recognize I've identified the wrong problem. Okay, let that sink in for a moment. I've identified, in a double loop process, it's not the solution that was wrong, it's the identification of the problem that was wrong. And this is what a master leader does. This is what a master communicator does. This is what communicators do who are really effective at managing change and initiating change. They don't just try another solution, another solution, another solution. They recognize something's not working the way I want, so therefore the problem I've identified is wrong. So the onus falls back to the sender of the message, the leader, and as opposed to the receiver. And I go back to the drawing board and say, all right, well, listen, I thought having not enough money was the problem. That's actually not the problem because I got more money. We got a big grant from the government. They gave us $5 million, and I plugged in the $5 million, and guess what? It's still not working. So the money obviously wasn't the problem. Something else is the problem. What's the problem? Maybe it's employee morale. Maybe it's engagement. Maybe it's our hiring process. So instead of just trying a new solution, I go back and identify a new problem. That's really important in the feedback process. So, and then we have to remember that all of this then takes place in the context of a chaotic system or a complex system. So the context in which this happens is really important. And that goes back to kind of what I was saying initially, that when I'm at work, the context is different. The metrics for success are different at work than at home with my family. The metrics for success at home are different. And if I fail to recognize that the context dictates what success looks like, then I am failing as a leader and as a communicator and as an agent of change. Ultimately, as an agent of change, I need to recognize the context I'm in and the situations that are being considered, that are being measured as successful in those situations. Okay, so there's some information there. So a context has to do with the background events and the background situations. Now, it's also true, you might be in an organization. So let's say you're working in a hospital, and even you say, well, the context is healthcare or the context is a hospital. Not true. Within the hospital, there are different departments. Within different departments, there are divisions. Within those divisions, there are units and wards and different things, different responsibilities. There's the accounting department, there's the clinical work, there's the research and development. There's all these different departments. Each one of those different departments have a different context. So when I'm talking to research and development, they have a specific context that determines success. When I'm talking to the nursing staff, they have a different context. The physicians, the administrators, the finance executives, there's all these what I call micro context within a macro context. We need to discern what those are. And then within the micro context, there's even more specific, and that's at the individual level. Each individual then has a specific context where they determine success by, and it's very important for us to understand what that is. So that's the mathematical theory of communication, and just as a general overview here, we've got this process. So the source is you and your filter. Your filter is your experiences, your background, your biases, and your values. You need to know what those are. You will never be the communicator or the change agent you need to be unless you understand you and your filter. Then there's the encoding process. That's crafting the message for their filter. Their being the receiver down here at the end, the receiver's filter. So you have to craft your message so that their filter will receive it, not yours. And this is where the first breakdown in communication typically occurs. We frame our messages typically for our filter. Then there's the channel. This is the mode in which you transcribe or transmit that information, whether it's written, whether it's verbal, whether it's face-to-face verbal or telephonically, whether it's email, message, social media, whatever. You need to convey that in a way that your receiver appreciates the most. And what that means for us is most of the time, that means we have to communicate the same message through multiple channels. All right, somebody write that down. That's critical. You will need to be effective, you will need to communicate the same message through multiple channels and most likely have to encode it in multiple ways. All right? Then there's the decoding, and this is the receiver and when they're first exposed to the message, how they filter it. And then there's the outcome of the message. How did the receiver actually take it? After that, there's the feedback, which typically is nonverbal. You typically either hear rumors about what you said and how you said it after the fact, and it's always like, oh, I didn't say that. I mean, again, if I could keep using the example of my wife and I's marriage, I'll say something and we'll have an argument, and maybe 2 or 3 weeks later it'll come up again, and she'll say, well, you said this, and I'm like, I never said that. I never even said that. I never meant that. That's not what I meant to communicate. And here, what I said, she took completely different. That's because this process here that we're talking about, I lost it. I coded it for me. I didn't code it properly. I picked the wrong channel. And by the time she received it, she heard something completely different than what I meant or hoped to even talk about. So that feedback is critical because I need to know that for next time. And then, of course, all that then takes place in the larger context of even my wife and I. The context of our home and communicating is different than the context of when we're with our friends on a social evening out. So on a night out with our friends, I'm going to communicate with her differently than I do than when we're at home alone. So context dictates everything, and context is the foundational linchpin to effective change, effective leadership, effective management across the board. And this is where this idea of contextual intelligence is really important, of navigating the context appropriately to get that. So that's the mathematical theory of communication. I don't know how long. So we want to take a break maybe for a minute and we'll get into part B.